now. Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Darren Michaels. I am the host of this Scott Labs webinar series, where we discuss interesting topics and try and answer questions related to wine, cider, or specialty beverage production. From yeast to nutrients to stabilization and filtration, we dip into the Scott Labs vault of over 80 years of experience to bring you the latest in research and technical applications. Today, hey, we have back with us Dr. Nichola Hall and her presentation about sluggish and stuck fermentations. This can be a tough subject, so please don't hesitate to ask questions if you normally do not. There's no judgment. There is no judgment, because this is everything I've dealt with. You know, it's just part of winemaking. It's just what you deal with. During the talk, I'll be posting several quick polls for you to answer. There's 3 of them, usually about like the 10 slide mark, the 20 slide mark, and like the 30 slide mark. As always, I'll make sure you see, if you can see the audio settings in the lower left and along the bottom, there's the raise hand button, the Q&A button, and those will be the main channels for communications. If you have any questions that occur to you during the talk, feel free to post the questions on the Q&A section. We already had one question. We will try and answer the question after the presentation. There's 40 slides, so we're going to go through those slides, and then we're going to try and do a lightning round as normal. Your questions will be anonymous, and so will your polling answers. So don't hesitate. I do stop the chatting just because there's a lot of noise, and we have to pay attention to mostly the Q&A and the hands raised. So that's the only reason I stopped the chatting, just because it's a little too much to try and cover. I'll also be looking for raised hands if you'd like to ask your questions live. It's always great to hear from some folks, especially, you know, with all the craziness happening right now. We'll be recording this webinar. I'm recording it now and making it available if you want to revisit any of the topics discussed. I always say this, I've said this before, sometimes in winemaking, it feels like herding cats. And especially when we run into stuck or sluggish ferments, those cats can be very, very hard to herd. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the microphone to Nichola. Nichola, how are you?
Hey, cheers, Darren. I am good. Okay. We good to go, Darren?
Yeah, ready when you are.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I'm ever really ready to dive into stuck and sluggish ferments. It's like herding cats or pulling teeth, but it is something we talk about. So we'll get ahead of it this season and give you the information and the tools in order to make good winemaking decisions to process wines.
And use pulling teeth. Use pulling teeth.
All right, guys. Okay, let me share this screen. Darren, let me know if you can see it.
I see that.
Okay, grand. Let me just put it into PowerPoint mode.
Perfect. Looks good.
And we'll get on with it. So Darren's snazzy title, Snap Out of It, Stuck and Sluggish Fermentations. So what we're going to go over today is how do you recognize a fermentation is stuck? And part of it is acknowledgement, right? We know what's going on. Sometimes we just need that little bit of help in, yeah, this one is no longer going to finish out on its own accord. We'll review quickly the major causes of problematic fermentations. The more you could pinpoint why a ferment has been challenging, the easier it is for us to troubleshoot and get it started again. We'll go through some options and considerations that you may want to take, or some things that we've heard about, and talk about kind of why they might work, why they won't work, and go through our preferred method to restart a fermentation step by step. Anybody who has made sparkling wine is very familiar with this method. And then, as Darren says, we will take questions. So fermentation profiles, right? What we like to say is that, let me move myself out of the way so I can actually see the fermentation profiles. When we graph a ferment, we'll see that a normal fermentation has about a 45-degree angle, kind of slowing at the end. We also see some things that have long lag phases, but finish out nicely. Some ferments are starting easily, then there is an abrupt arrest. Some ferments can be sluggish throughout, and some will become sluggish as we are getting into that last 1/3 of fermentation. And it's really the becoming sluggish ferments that we're going to discuss today. There are different reasons why things have a longer lag phase, that there is a abrupt rest or become sluggish, but most of us are familiar with those fermentation profiles and what is stopping things abruptly or what is giving us long lag phases. So what Dr. Bisson defined as an incomplete or stuck fermentation as those that have higher than desired residual sugar at the end of alcoholic fermentation. And sluggish ferments are characterized by a low rate of sugar consumption for the yeast. So there is technical definitions for what a stuck fermentation is and what a sluggish fermentation is. We're just going to kind of roll them both together today for the presentation. But there is, as I said, those technical definitions. How we're going to recognize whether a ferment is becoming sluggish or is going to stick is by following that fermentation. And what we'll say is once you've reached round about 1 Brix and you're dropping about 0.25 or 1/4 Brix per day, and the temperature is a good range for the end of fermentation, which is round about 6 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius. So if temperature is good and you're going about 1/4 Brix a day, you may want to get ahead of it because that is a signal that we are getting that stuck fermentation. When you're graphing it, you're no longer at that 45-degree angle, and you're even shallower angle than the 30 degrees that we see at the end of ferment.
Hey, Nichola, I don't see it change. I haven't seen any change in slides.
Oh, you have? Okay, sorry. I don't know what's... Let me share this again.
It's just been the title. There you go. Yeah.
Oh,
yep.
You know, just pause for thought. Well, there wasn't not much that you missed, okay? Fermentation profiles, and this is where we are. So what we'll say is a sugar level that's remained stable for 48 hours or 2 days is considered stuck. And what we have to ask ourselves is, what is a realistic final fermentation goal for that wine style that we're making? We'll normally say a dry wine with regards to glucose and fructose is less than 1 gram per liter. But we'll sometimes have people call the office, say, I'm at 1.2 grams per liter. I want this to be restarted. Is that reasonable? Is that realistic? So that's a question you have to ask yourself as winemakers. But technically, most things that are stuck are normally stuck at a higher sugar level than that 1 gram per liter. So dealing with problematic fermentations is not new. I think the first report in literature was back in the late 1800s by the father of microbiology himself, Louis Pasteur, and we've actively been researching it back into the late 70s. And a lot of things that we've learned from the research as the causal agents of stuck and sluggish fermentations, we have incorporated into our good fermentation practices. So we're not dealing with some of those basic reasons that things stick. We're not seeing as many of the abrupt stuck fermentations. We're really seeing those fermentations dragging out at the end. And what our research has told us is the major causes of sluggish and stuck fermentation is improper yeast selection and improper yeast handling. So you haven't actually chosen a yeast that is suitable to the juice or must matrix. That you don't have enough healthy yeasts there to begin with. So remember, during fermentation, the majority of sugar depletion occurs when the cells have entered into their stationary phase and are actually in that decline or death phase. Once you hit the beginning of stationary phase, your yeast has only consumed about 30% sugar. So you've still got 70% sugar to be consumed. So really we're talking about the majority of fermentation happening being a game of numbers. We need enough yeast there, and that yeast has to be healthy to consume the sugar. We've learned a lot about nutrient deficiencies, and we're starting to understand more about nutrient imbalances that can cause problematic fermentations. We've, as an industry, really got a good handle on nitrogen being the major driver of biomass production and fermentation rate. However, if we don't have enough vitamins there or enough minerals there, our yeast cannot go through the glycolytic pathway, and we'll end up with elevated pyruvate or elevated acetaldehyde levels, and we don't get to that terminal ethanol that we're desiring. If you have absolutely no oxygen there, that is a major cause of stuck and sluggish fermentation. So remember, oxygen is a yeast nutrient. In situations where oxygen is deficient, and we say that a minimal level of oxygen for a healthy fermentation is 5 parts per million, and the most oxygen a yeast will need is about 10 parts per million. So remember, oxygen is required by Saccharomyces for lipid synthesis. Those lipids work their way into the plasma membrane, so you have got a structurally intact and functional membrane for sugar uptake to continue. So when we don't have enough oxygen there, then we have a decrease in biomass, we have a decrease in cell viability, and we have problems at the end of fermentation. The other thing that gives us problems at the end of fermentation is if we don't manage our temperatures correctly. Temperature on its own is not toxic to Saccharomyces cerevisiae. However, it is when you have other antagonistic compounds present, like acetic acid, especially when acetic acid is above 0.8 grams per liter. When you have ethanol is a toxin. When you have your short and medium chain fatty acids. So the yeast are producing the short, medium chain fatty acids as a means of producing long chain fatty acids for plasma membrane integrity. If the yeast can't finish that metabolic step or can't produce what it needs, we end up with these intermediate compounds, and short and medium chain fatty acids are one of those. And the toxicity of them is really amplified when we have alcohol present or when the pH is low. They actually inhibit the cell's ability to take up the sugar. Sometimes our chemistry is good, we've got enough cells there, but we have an increase in the lactic acid bacteria. And the lactic acid bacteria are going to be nice and healthy after the yeast has done quite a bit of work. So the yeast is going to be at a more weakened state at the end of fermentation or the latter stages of fermentation. The lactic acid bacteria associated with the grapes and the winery environment is going to be pretty healthy at that time. So you could have an inhibition of your Saccharomyces due to the presence of Enococcus or other lactic acid bacteria. Or it could be our processing decisions. We've over-clarified our white or rosés for one reason or another. So we've settled out all those phytosterols, which are growth factors for the yeast. We've added more than 50 parts SO2, so we've inhibited or we've deactivated our thymine. So there's a lot of things that can cause stuck and sluggish fermentations. The challenge is these things don't act on their own. It's the synergistic effect of multiple reasons that kind of cause our yeast to shut down. So when we're troubleshooting these, we're asking a lot of questions to find out kind of what the status of the fruit was coming in, all the way through how the fermentation behaved and what additions happened during the fermentation. But there are sometimes we go through all those factors and everything looks good and we're just still scratching our head. We're like, there are still things that we do not know what has caused my ferment to stick. Is it residual herbicides, fungicides, pesticides from the vineyard? Is it some unknown enological parameter? We're starting to learn more about this with regards to malolactic bacteria and the inhibition of high levels of polyphenolics. So what else is in there that we have not looked at that is synergistic with the ethanol, the temperature, the pH, and the low nutritional status that causes our ferments to stick. So it's always great if you can do some sort of troubleshooting to determine why. Sometimes we can't always get there. So what we want to do is, when we have acknowledged our fermentation is sluggish, is sticking, or is stuck, we want to react quickly. And a lot of winemakers want to deal with stuck and sluggish fermentations once they've got all the other ferments that they're dealing with dry, they've got them all ML, and they've got time to react to the sluggish fermentation. The quicker you react, the easier it is in general terms to get your restart going again. So it's really important that you know what's going on, both from an analytical standpoint as well as a microbiological standpoint, so that we can take the best course of action with regards to getting the wine finished and overall wine quality. So we want to adapt a protocol that's simple, but it's effective. We don't want to do more than we need to, but we definitely have to do enough to get us to what our level of dryness is. So if your fermentation stops and you've got a decent amount of sugar there, so more than 15 grams per liter, and it's still low ethanol, then restarting the ferment is pretty easy with all things being considered. If your fermentation stops and you've got less than 10 grams per liter of sugar and you've got more than 12% alcohol, restarting it's really challenging. And part of the reason is that Saccharomyces cerevisiae is what we call a Crabtree positive yeast, that its metabolism will be dictated by the level of sugar. So whether it ferments or respires is dictated with regards to sugar level. And we think this 10 grams per liter is the absolutely lowest that the cells can handle before they go into a respiratory mode of respiration. Yet the cells can't go into respiratory mode of metabolism when the alcohol is that high. So we've got the cell's inability to metabolize the sugar by their preferred pathways because of the inhibition of ethanol. So that's why it's really challenging. And this is kind of what we're going to focus on. This is the stuck fermentations that we're going to talk you through. Okay, as we move forward. So as I said, we want to adapt a protocol that's simple, but is effective. And we can get our wine to dryness, we can get it microbiologically stable as quickly as we can, while preserving some of those aromatics we worked so hard to get. So let's look at these options and considerations. So I'm gonna throw elephant in the room, the thing I get asked all the time. So I'm gonna get it over and done with. Can I use active lees? Can I take a ferment, something that's actively fermenting, and blend over? Well, we can say you can do whatever you want, but really when we're talking about good practices, if you were to do that, you'd have to add at least 5 to 20% of the volume so that your cell population is high enough to attack that sugar. Now, the cells have to be in have had to experience similar chemistry, so they will have to have seen a similar level of alcohol or within a few percent in order for that to be successful. The reason it sometimes works is you do increase the sugar, so you're getting the yeast back into that fermentative mode, but it will also increase the toxins, or potentially, depending on what you blend over. It could increase the ethanol, it could increase the volatile acidity, it can increase those short, medium chain fatty acids, as well as introducing lactic acid bacteria. So what can happen is you can end up with a much larger volume of stuck wine. And then that's before we even start discussing our varietal and our AVA percentages. Have you diluted those? Have you compromised those? So generally, I'll tell people this is not it's not advisable, because the yeasts are probably in different growth phases, And if they're not, if they're at the same level of alcohol or very similar, the cells that you're blending over could also be in their death and decline phase. And we also have that contamination concern. So sometimes this will work. More often than not, it doesn't. So what are some other options and considerations, especially as we're talking about contamination concerns with lactics? So how do we know if we have lactics present? Well, we're measuring our chemistries. We're looking at our pre-fermentation lactic acid, and we're looking at our, malic acid, and we're looking at our current malic acid and seeing, okay, is there a drop that's considered? Is there something that's telling us we have lactic acid bacteria present? And we're looking at our microbiology. We might be looking at our scorpions, and it's actually confirming that. So if we have our lactics there, they will shut down the yeast, or the yeast will shut down in their presence. So we want to take them out of the picture, and we can do so by adding an antimicrobial agent. We can add about 250 parts per million, either lysozyme or Bacillus. You would add lysozyme if your ml is not complete, or if it's not started, but you still want it to go through ml at a later date once alcohol fermentation is complete. You could add Bacillus if your ml is complete and you're in a low solids environment. So they both will attack the lactic acid bacteria. Their mode of action is different, and your ability to inoculate and get ml through will differ depending on what your choice is here. So if ml you want to get through, kill the lactics off with lysozyme, ml's done, then Bacillus is your choice. If the ferment's been pretty healthy, we don't have a lot of acetaldehyde in there. So we haven't stuck our ferment due to lack of minerals and vitamins. Then we can add a little bit of SO2. The reason that we don't want to add the SO2, obviously, if we have a lot of acetaldehyde, because acetaldehyde is going to bind up quicker, and the SO2 won't be available to knock back the lactics. But if the wine is relatively healthy, we can add about 20 parts SO2 to knock back the bacteria. And again, that is pH dependent. The lower the pH, the less SO2 you want to add. Can we just throw in some more nutrients? Is another question I get asked often, and the answer to that is it depends. You cannot, or you should not add ammonia because it's ineffective above 9% alcohol, because the transport system, the general aminopermease that takes up ammonia, is no longer active once you reach a certain level of alcohol. Now, Fermentation, because it does not contain any ammonia, it doesn't contain any DEP, that can sometimes work. And the reason it sometimes works as the amino acids can work to rebalance the redox of the wine, the NAD and the NADH as the cells work through the glycolytic pathway. But you've got to intervene within about 72 hours of inactivation of the sugar transport proteins. Remember, sugar is taken up across the plasma membrane by the help of these sugar transport proteins. And we have different proteins that work at different levels of sugar. They've got about a 6 to 8 hour half-life. So if you go much longer than 72 hours, the cell's not going to be able to utilize the amino acids in order to make more proteins. So nutrient additions sometimes work, sometimes doesn't, but you've got to be careful in adding Fermentation if you do have a big lactic population. So you always take care of the bacteria before you even try and add some more nutrients. Sometimes we've just got to face the fact, and we've got to remove the chemical antagonists. We've got to get the VA less than 0.8 grams per liter, especially when the ethanol is high. And ethanol being high, I'm going to say about 14%, because that is a synergistic effect. Sometimes though, just removing those short, medium chain fatty acids that the yeast have produced can work. So it just depends on the conditions. And it's the entire conditions of the wine. So we know to remove the VA, we have to do a DVA through reverse osmosis, same way we have to go through some sort of membrane exclusion system to remove the ethanol. But to remove the short, medium chain fatty acids, we can add absorbents. And we generally add a yeast-based absorbent to remove these toxic byproducts of the yeast metabolism. Traditionally, we use yeast hulls. More recently, we've used specialty inactivated yeast, and the choice can be successful, or this can be successful depending on what you choose to do, what your conditions are. But the yeast hulls and the rescue, they are different. And I thought I'd put this in here because I do explain this to people a lot. So what are yeast hulls? Yeast hulls are the fractions of the cell walls remaining after the yeast extract, so the yeast cytoplasm and all the intracellular organelles have been harvested. The yeast hull may or may not have membrane material present. It depends how they've been prepared. So because the yeast hull is really a byproduct, then the cell wall has been broken up, so it has reduced binding capacity. The rescue differs because it is an autolyzed whole yeast with the cell walls fairly intact. And so all the binding residues on the cell wall are optimized, so they're fully intact so that they can bind these short, medium chain fatty acids. So where do I place our yeast hulls in our current portfolio compared to our rescue? Well, to me, yeast hulls still have a role. It's to increase the surface area and over-clarify juice. And our rescue is really to remove these short, medium chain fatty acids. And you can see from the technical data sheet for rescue that different cell wall fractions will have different binding capacities for these C6, C8, C10 fatty acids that inhibit the fermentation. So rescue actually does a better job at removing some of those compared to other cell wall fractions. And also we see in our fermentation rate that our ferment is 4 days faster using a specific inactivated yeast rather than just other cell walls. So that's why we will talk to you so much about rescue. And then, as I said, sometimes the simplest thing is the best, just adjusting the environmental conditions. So as I mentioned, we've got a lot of sugar transport proteins in there, and they all work under different conditions. The sugar transport protein responsible for fructose uptake, which is generally what is remaining at the end of ferment, it checks T3, works best when the temperature is between 68 and 72. Okay, so you want to adjust your temperature. So the end of ferment and whites, unless it's a barrel ferment, you want to warm the tank, and reds, you sometimes want to cool the tank to optimize that sugar uptake. And then your yeast has to have access to the sugar. So you've got to mix the tank. Your yeast will settle out. A tank is not self-mixing. In general terms, at the beginning of ferment, it's not self-mixing. As the yeast are growing exponentially and producing a lot of CO2, it's fairly self-mixing. But after that, you'll have striations and your yeast will settle out. So you do have to mix to keep them in suspension. If you've gone through and considered, okay, my conditions are good, I've done a detox, my temperature is good, I am going to have to do a restart. Then the next consideration is, what yeast strain do I use? Which strain do I choose from the portfolio? Okay. We've got three options. We've got our encapsulated yeast, which are pre-acclimatized, and these are immobilized in calcium alginate, and you hang them in the tank in the bags, and they need quite a lot of babysitting and a lot of work You've got to keep on taking the sugar to them because they're not free floating. We have regular active dried yeast, and we have active dried yeast, which is somewhat pre-acclimated to the fermentation environment. But whatever you choose, that strain has to have the ability to consume fructose in a very low nutrient environment and be alcohol tolerant. So not all strains are going to be suitable. So how do we determine which strains are suitable? And this is the F word I do not like to use, is we determine the fructophilic index. And what we'll do is we look at the yeast's ability to consume glucose, and we look at the yeast's ability to consume fructose. We graph them, and we look at the difference between those two curves. And the closer the curves are, the better the yeast capacity to consume fructose. And we call it its fructophilic index. So when we do that and we graph them, we'll see that Uvaferm 43 has a much higher capacity to consume fructose than things like EC1118 or D21 or 721B. Now, this is our Lallemand strains, or anchor strains are not on here, but it lets us see why we want to be choosing Uvaferm 43 as our restart strain of choice most of the time. So your yeast choice is there. The other thing you need to make sure is that you have enough yeast there that can consume this last little bit of fructose remaining. So starter prep. Okay, we've got our Uvaferm 43, and now we have Uvaferm 43 restart. Well, what's with that? Way to confuse us, calling having two strains with the same name. So let's look at why they're different. Remember, Lallemand is a yeast producer as well as a bacteria producer, just like you're all wine producers. So you can do different things during your production to get different outcomes. So our Uvaferm 43, what I call the regular 43, is produced like you would any other active dried strain. Our Uvaferm 43 restart is subjected to all these stresses during the growth process. So we produce it, for want of a better term, like we would bacteria. Our MBR strains of bacteria. So they've seen the stress of alcohol, they've seen the stress of pH, they've seen the stress of low nutrients. So they're somewhat acclimated to that very harsh environment, which is why with regular 43, we've got to do a multi-stage build-up, like a multi-stage PIED-DE-CUVE to acclimate the yeast. Whereas our 43 restart, we can kind of skip a lot of those phases, because the cells are much more robust and they acclimate to that toxic environment much quicker. And just even comparing the two, we'll see the 43 restart will finish out the problematic ferment a week quicker when all the conditions are the same. It's just the yeast. So if you've spoken to any of us, we'll tell you that our current preferred method is the rapid restart method using Uvaferm 43 restart. And it's on page 38 of the 2020 handbook. And I'm going to kind of walk you through that and kind of why some of the things are recommended that they are, to give you a better understanding, or kind of behind the curtain look at the theory and the logic behind the suggestions. But you do still have to follow some necessary steps. You've got to prep your wine. Okay, you can't just throw the yeast in there. The wine's got to be prepared to set you up for success. You prepare your starter, which we call the PIED-DE-CUVE. You prepare that starter mixture. You prepare your yeast. You inoculate your PIED-DE-CUVE, and then you could initiate your restart. And each of these steps it's important that you follow directly the procedure to get the best outcome. So reds, how are we going to, step one, prepare our wine? It's always a detoxification and a microbial control. So we're going to prepare 40 grams per hectoliter of rescue And we make our rescue up like we do our active dried yeast in 10 times its weight in 100 degree water, give or take a few degrees, and let it swell for 20 minutes. That way we optimize binding capacity of the cell wall. It's going to bind those fermentation inhibitors. When we add it and we mix it thoroughly, we release some of that CO2 pressure, and we control our unwanted microbial growth using either lysozyme, Bacillus, or SO2, whatever is most suitable for that wine's conditions. 48 to 72 hours later, we're going to press. And if you've already pressed, then you'll rack. And that's going to eliminate those. It's going to eliminate those toxins, the unwanted bacteria, yeast, some CO2 that's still in suspension. We may find it decreases the temperature and gets us more to that ideal temperature of 68 to 72, and it might release a little bit of nutrients that's still in the grapes. Remember to check your sugar before your detox, and normally 24 hours after your pressing. So that's about 4 days after you first add the rescue. Because if it's your fermentation is stuck, you've still got nice population cells, but the cells were shutting down or sugar transport was no longer possible because of our short medium chain fatty acids, that might be enough to get your ferment to go through to dryness. So double check the sugars, see if that on its own works. Similar situation for white wines. You're going to add your rescue, control unwanted microbial growth, and rack, checking that sugar before and again 24 hours after you've done that racking to see if there's any movement in sugar. And sometimes, as I mentioned, same with reds, that might be enough to push it through. If it's not, if you do have to go through the full restart protocol, your step 2 is preparing the starter culture, your PIED-DE-CUVE. And this protocol's for 1,000 gallons. So you get your 50 gallons of your rescue treated wine, 40 gallons of chlorine-free water, and you add a little bit of Ferment-O to that. You adjust the bricks to about 5 and you mix thoroughly, okay? So why do we have to add water? Well, we don't, but what we do have to do is reduce the alcohol to less than 9%. Even with the 43 restart, we still have to give it a head start, and reducing the alcohol helps with that, okay? Why do we have to bring the sugar up, okay? The reason is, as I was mentioning, Saccharomyces is a Crabtree positive yeast. It requires sugar for fermentation. When the sugar's too low, the yeast will not go after it because it just doesn't have the machinery to go after it in a respiratory mode. So we're increasing the sugar to help with the yeast metabolism. The other thing we're doing is we're changing the ratio of glucose to fructose, putting it more in favor of the glucose so those hexose transporters can be operational again and the sugar uptake continues. Now, if you want, you have to decide how you want to adjust those bricks based on where you are in the US. But it is important that the alcohol is reduced and the sugar is increased. You rehydrate your yeast. You're going to rehydrate your yeast like you would any yeast rehydration. But your yeast, the amount of yeast you add is a little bit higher. So you're going to add your 2 kilos per 1,000 gallons of Go Firm Protect Evolution into some hot water. You let that cool. You add 1.5 kilos per 1,000 of Overfirm 43 Restart. You mix it gently to incorporate it. And after 20 minutes, you do have to start that acclimatization process where you are taking some of that prepared starter, some of that PIED-DE-CUVE starter, and adding it into your rehydrated yeast to drop the temperature no more than 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're holding it for 20 minutes, just like you would when you're acclimatizing regular yeast for the primary ferment. Once it's acclimated, you add your rehydrated yeast slurry into your PIED-DE-CUVE and you monitor sugar depletion. Okay, so it's important that you monitor this sugar depletion, because once the Brix of your starter has dropped to 0, you add your entire volume of your PIED-DE-CUVE into the full volume of wine. Okay. You do add about 1.5 kilograms of fermented oil to your 1,000 gallons and you mix the tank well. But why do I need to add more fermented oil? And it's so you could keep regenerating those sugar transport proteins that have a 6 to 8 hour half-life, so sugar uptake can continue. Okay, so it's important that we give the yeast a fighting chance. And during the process, we want to measure our glucose and fructose. We want to make sure that fermentation is continuing. You might want to measure your malic acid just to make sure that you've got the microbes in check, and also your volatile acidity. We want to make sure that we're not producing any more VA, which will then make the life so much more difficult for the yeast. So that's kind of the steps of how to go through a ferment and the whys. So for me, the critical steps in dealing with a ferment is you want to react quickly. You don't want to wait months and get to it once you've got everything else taken care of in the cellar. I know it's not the most practical advice, but it is just from a wine quality standpoint important you do so. The other critical step is managing the drop of sugar in your starter when you're going from that 5 Brix to 0 Brix. If you let it go much past that, again, you're going to switch that metabolism. So you want to ensure that doesn't happen. And depending on the wine, the drop in sugar from 5 Brix to 0 can be anything from 18 hours to 40 hours. So normally I'll tell people, start at kind of midday-ish, kind of later in the afternoon. And that way, if it's a pretty easy wine to restart, then the yeast will not run out of sugar in the middle of the night. You want to manage that temperature so that you do have the best chance in getting the sugar to be consumed in that ethanolic environment, and you want to manage microbial competition. So with that, we've gone over how you can identify that a fermentation may stick or is stuck, what the major causes are so that we can reevaluate our ferments and see if we can say this was why it's stuck, or if you have ferments from the same vineyard year after year stick, maybe it's time to start to look at things more collectively rather than as individuals and see if you can determine the whys. We looked at some of the options and considerations for restarting a problem fermentation, why some of them may work on their own, why some of them are not advisable. And we walked through our preferred method to restart a fermentation. And with that, I'm kind of going to turn it back over to Darren. But thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And lightning round, Darren.
Yeah, that was really great. That was, wow, what can I say? That was really good. And we got, we got a lot of questions, to be honest with you. And then we have a call in hand. So I'm gonna ask Albert if he has a chance to talk. Did you have a quick question, Albert?
Yes, I do. So I have a fermentation that I thought was stuck, and it sticks and then it moves. It sticks and then it moves, and it's all the way down to 1% now.
Oh, so you're not real. Go ahead. Sorry.
So the question is, why is it doing that? Or is it a comment?
No, I want to know why it will stay at 1.5 for a week or so, and then all of a sudden it's down to 1.
So what's the volume that you're dealing with and where are you sampling?
I have just 1 barrel.
Okay. And you're sampling top.
Yes.
So your yeast is going to settle down and your yeast will generally associate with the lees. So if they start to consume a little bit of sugar, they might produce a little bit of CO2 and start to kick out some, consume sugar and settle out. So you need to keep your ferment mixed, especially at the end of fermentation. That mixing during the last third is really important. So give it a mix. And if the yeast are still healthy and still have the capacity to consume sugar, then that should help. Now, if this is a southern hemisphere fruit and it's been stuck for a while, the reason ferment kicks back off, what we would say in the spring, is really not so much to do with temperatures warming up. It's to do with the rate of yeast autolysis. As the yeast breaks down, it releases nutrients and can help the yeast consume that last little bit of sugar due to the release of amino acids, vitamins, and minerals. So stir that ferment.
I will.
Thank you, Albert. That was really good. Thank you. All right, so we already answered one question. What happens to yeast after the expiration date? He wrote, viability will start to decline and its fermentation capacity will be compromised. That was one of the first questions. We've got about 17 questions here. Is there a Brix below which you won't be able to restart, say 0.25?
The lower the Brix, the harder it is. And it's going to depend on all of the conditions. I think it gets really hard once you get under 10 grams per liter of sugar. And that's why in the restart, you do have to adjust the Brix. If it's 2% sugar, that was what we used to call dryness. So it all depends on the style of wine as well, how much sugar that wine can handle. Your microbial stability protocol post-fermentation, and kind of what is your full risk assessment. But once it's less than 10 grams per liter, it's really hard.
Yeah, and I remember I've had to make that mentioned 0.25 Brix, so it's hard to know. But if it's glue-free at 0.25 grams per 100 mil, or that's when it starts to really get hard to make that decision. But it's so hard to change to restart, and a lot of times I have the conversation with folks with generally just saying, hey, let's just cut it. Let's just make sure we don't do more damage than we possibly want to do. How soon after adding lysozyme can you do restart?
So it depends if it's reds or whites. In reds, the lysozyme will be bound up with the tannins within about 72 hours. In whites, you don't have the tannins there to bind it up. So normally I give it about 3 days. Now, I like to rack off the lysozyme, so you don't want the lysozyme in there for more than 7 days. So depends. As soon as the lyso's settled, get off of it in whites, but pretty quickly, because the lysozyme doesn't have any impact.
All right. Okay. And then this is a good question. If restarting does not initially work, how successful will be attempt number 2 or number 3?
Depends what you did for attempt number 1. We'll talk people through the restart and say, I followed the protocol. I did everything the book said. And by the time we met step 3, there's been deviations. Yeah. So if you've honestly, if you've been honest with yourself and you've looked at your chemical parameters, you've taken care of any microbial competition, you've followed the protocol, so it should work. Now, if it doesn't, you need to work out why it didn't. Number 2, if that doesn't work, number 3, I'd be like, there's something going on here. Sometimes we need to change the yeast because there's something in that wine that yeast doesn't need. But the yeast that you choose has to be able to consume the fructose.
Yeah. I've also had that conversation with folks like, and myself, when it's come down to, you know, say it's
Yeah.
like about a brick, it's like kind of like, okay, we commit, you know, you commit to the restart. It's like I kind of like push it along, cross my fingers, watching the VAs. It's funny how many times when people ask me what to do or maybe ask for advice, and I'm like, well, what's your RS? What's your malic? What's your VA? What's your alcohol? And they're like, I don't know, but what should I do? And I'm like,
Run
it is so
numbers.
good question. You know what I mean? It's like,
Mhm.
do it when you do it well, and do it, you know, do it, try and do the best you can is the bottom line. What
Yeah.
is a good method to introduce oxygen if deficient? Maybe a pump over?
So your yeast, as I said, need between 5 and 10 parts per million. You will get, with a good punch down, you'll get 3 to 4. A good pump over, you get about 5. De la Stage, you get about 7. Venturi, you'll get even more. So with traditional, a good pump over should get enough oxygen in there. Your yeast need oxygen at the onset of fermentation and round about a third of the way through, from a yeast health standpoint.
So what about at the end? Like, or is it, like, another follow-up question is, does adding oxygen to a sluggish fermentation help the yeast to complete the fermentation? What if you're sluggish?
I don't think it's so much a direct effect of oxygen. I think it's more effect that you're blowing off CO2 and giving the tank a mix. So I think it's an indirect impact.
You know, there's been plenty of times where I've had a stuck or sluggish, and I just simply moving it, you know, maybe adding rescue or something like that can help.
Yeah.
We were actually dealing with that up here in Washington earlier this year, where they had a whole bunch of kind of sluggish ferments, and we ended up just adding rescue to them, and that in of itself seemed to make it speed up. But I have found that evidence. I have found situations where just simply racking it or barreling it down, it kind of seemed to spark it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then quick question, what is Bacillus?
Bacillus is a chitin glucan chitosan blend that we get from the cell walls of Aspergillus niger that has impact against lactic acid bacteria as well as acetic acid bacteria. So it's an antimicrobial agent.
Is there a time when the Brix are so low that you can't add Fermate-O?
Yeast will release amino acids at the end of fermentation. So they have a very quick uptake, and then they'll have this release. So you will always have some amino acids in there. I just a regular ferment, not for a restart. I don't want to add it. I think about 10% alcohol is probably the upper end. And how much I'd add? 10, 12.5 grams per hectoliter. So no more than a pound per thousand.
Oh, okay, so not even a pound.
Case by case situation.
Yeah. I mean, I have some, like, you know, I have questions from folks that haven't inoculated, you know what I mean? They're like native or organic producers, and you know, it's like they hope, you know, I've had that conversation where it's like, oh, I hope if I could just add Fermate-O basically at small increments all the way through, like down to 0 breaks, it would help me. And I've never seen a really good correlation with that and helping, you know, at a certain point, like below 10 breaks. It's just like, I don't know, man, it's just too much yeast sometimes. What rates of yeast holes and or rescue do you recommend?
Rescue 40 grams per hectoliter, which is 3.3 pounds per thousand. It's autolyzed yeast, so we don't have a legal limit. Yeast hulls, the TTB limit is 3 pounds per 1,000 gallons.
Okay. You know, I mean, back when I started, we would do yeast hulls, and then
that's what we had.
Yeah, and then when products like Rescue came out, I was really surprised to see where I really saw that be effective. Honestly, was ones when I didn't want to do a restart, and I was hoping just to add a little, especially with reds, you know, kind of ripe reds. It seemed to like kind of help with just, you know, avoiding like a hardcore restart. You know what I mean? Can you make up multiple additions of Rescue due to one or more failed restarts if needed, or will that be a problem? Will that cause other issues?
If your rescue should have bound most of the short medium chain fatty acids when it was added the first time. So I don't think you need more than one addition.
Okay.
That was I don't think.
Vit end, does that have yeast hulls in it? I mean, what is in vit end?
Okay, so nutrient vit end is another inactivated yeast that we actually, our Spanish market had great success with it for restart fermentation. So we brought it into our portfolio. Comparing vit end and rescue actually does a better job at binding those short medium chain fatty acids. So it will bind them. Rescue just does a better job. So if we're to put the three products in comparison, because we sell all three, the least effective is yeast hulls. The most effective is a rescue, and in the middle you have nutrient vit end.
Okay. Do you have any tips for avoiding negative, quote, stressed aromas generated during restart of fermentation? I guess, maybe the question too is like, anything to add outside of what we already recommend to help with off aromas potentially generated by restart of fermentation? I mean, it's basically doing a proper restart the only way to fix it or try and prevent it.
Well, it depends what off aromas are we talking about. Are we talking about sulfides? We're talking about VAs? Are we talking about soapy aromatics because these short medium chain fatty acids?
Yeah.
Essentially, if you get off of the native yeast, and the native yeast is the yeast, I'm using that in the broadest sense of the word, the yeast that conducted the primary fermentation, if you get off of them as quickly as you can, that will take away their compaction stresses and help to avoid the release of the stressed compounds that we perceive from a negative sensory standpoint.
Okay.
So a nice clean racking or a filtration if you can't get a good clean racking.
And I have on occasion, if there was a hydrogen sulfide issue, I have had on occasion add Regulus, at that point too. It seemed to really help, which was like a very much proactive way of dealing with it. Mm-hmm. But I could see other aromas potentially popping up. The other time too, anytime I would imagine there'd be a little potential issue would be if you did have a fairly significant spoilage component that's causing the issue. And maybe secondarily, I mean, I've had situations where I've stuck ferments and they've come out almost putrescine and cadaverine, which was of course kind of like, wow, too late now. But it was clear that we hadn't done a judicious job in preventing lactic acid bacteria production. There's another question here, which I'll just go ahead. It says, when you say check glucose and fructose, do you mean check gravity and hydrometer? No, we mean literally a direct measurement, typically enzymatically, of glucose and fructose. It is not hydrometry. It's not a density-based, solids-based analysis where we have a scale that's gradual or calibrated to a sucrose standard, which is a hydrometry. When we talk about glucose fructose, let me be very clear, we're talking about direct measurement of glucose fructose. And I know there's some units out there that are FTIR based that portend to tell you the glucose fructose. I can't stress this enough. It is not a direct measurement. It is not necessarily the glucose fructose. It's actually the only way to get that is a direct measurement, and most typically enzymatically. There's a couple guys out there that I know for a fact are using HPLC. That's kind of like, hitting it with a huge hammer. But typically when we talk about enzymatic analysis, and it's glucose fructose direct analysis. Did you have anything to add on that?
Yeah. So you're going to use hydrometry during the fermentation process to determine sugar depletion. You can use a hydrometer if you're doing a restart, looking at it going from 5 Brix to 0. But to actually know how much fermentable sugar is left, you must run a glucose and fructose.
Yeah. In the case of low nutrient must, do you recommend 2 nutrient additions at 1/3 and then add 2/3 sugar depletion, or just 1 addition?
And low nutrient must, I recommend the first addition at 2 to 3 Brix drop, the second one, irrespective of the original yarn, at 1/3 sugar depletion. Once you get to 2/3, the yeast are already in that stationary phase and they're not able to utilize the nutrients as well due to the ethanol.
Gotcha.
We kind of went over that in one of the webinars, so you can check that out or check out the nutrient section in the handbook. I think it's page 44, which is the nutrient supplementation planner based on your yeast strain, your original yarn, and your fermentation goal.
Yeah, we covered that a little bit with the webinar Budding Geniuses. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very, very thorough pair of webinars. So I do invite you guys to go back to check those out. I noticed some of my wines that are sticking are simultaneously going through ML. Is this the reason why these have slowed down? I see a small decrease, then an increase. Should we be mixing these? How long of a mix do you recommend?
So yeah, ML, so Enococcus can slow down your alcoholic fermentation. So either you let it go through ML and then you kill off the bacteria once you have finished ML, because you don't want to end up with a VA bomb if you have a heterofermentative lactic acid bacteria there. Should you be mixing these? You should mix your ferments. Ferments are not self-mixing during the majority of fermentation. They can be self-mixing during the active growth phase. So the last third of ferment is really important to mix them. And generally, I say a mixing depends on the volume, size, and shape of tank. But if you say, okay, well, I'm racking this with this setup, it would take me 5 minutes. I would mix for 3 to 5 minutes. You want to turn over the volume.
Yeah. How is lysozyme chitosan specific to lactobacillus conchii? I mean, it's not. Is it any less effective to lactobacillus than it is to Enococcus? Are they about the same as far as sensitivity?
Different organisms have different sensitivities to different antimicrobials. In the wine industry, it's no different.
Okay.
Yeah, it seems to be a little bit challenging for us. We did do some original work with ETS looking at the impact of Bacillus with conchii. It did an okay job, but it did not reduce the population 100%. I think it took it down about 90%.
Yeah, and then zygo too, Zygosaccharomyces. I wouldn't expect it to do much with that.
No.
Yeah.
Zygo, we don't really understand. We know it comes in on concentrates, but we don't have a great idea of how to handle it. We talk about it adding hazes, but I haven't seen any work with it causing any negative sensory impacts or stock fermentations. But with our new qPCR, we may actually be able to trace it back to problematic ferments.
And then VAs and restart. You mentioned 0.8 grams per liter. So if you had a 1.1 gram per liter wine, would you recommend DVAing before trying the restart?
I would, especially based on legal limits. And if this wine's still got quite a decent aging, it just depends on the rest of the conditions of the wine. You may be able to restart that just fine. You may not. Yeah. And as we say, 0.8 is where we get above 0.8 is where we get uncomfortable. For yeast, above 0.5 really for bacteria.
Yeah.
I said 0.5 because I can't remember if it's 0.4 or 0.6.
What is the lowest temp for a restart? I mean, what's your minimum temperature when you do
7.9. No, you want it to be at 68. I mean, 64, 65 will be okay, but try to get as close to 68, 20 degrees Celsius as possible.
Okay, yeah. Always, everything's like it's always 65, 68. You know what I mean? When it comes to like ML and it comes to restarts, we have, I think I see a trend there. What are the ramifications of adding too much rescue? Can I add it twice during a fermentation?
I think anytime you add something or want to add something, you go, what is my goal? What am I trying to achieve? If rescue is going to bind short, medium chain fatty acids, you prepare it properly and you add the recommended amount. What function is the second add going to have? So I don't think it's necessary to add it twice.
Okay.
Unless something was really haywire.
You know, and I just had that conversation with somebody. They've been dealing with, I think, what we think is a pesticide spray, to be honest with you, when we actually track back to some stuff in the vineyard. But they'd already added rescue and they're asking to add it again. And I said, well, you've already added it and now we're going to rack and actually start doing the restart. I said, there's probably no point at this point. You've already added it. And we're going to rack and do the restart. So don't add any more. Do you think here's a question. Do you think Go Farm Protect Evolution is necessary in the yeast rehydration? They think it has a strong vitamin smell. I haven't seen an issue with that, but in the end with the finished wine, but do you ever hear about that?
I don't think it has a vitamin smell. I think it has a yeasty smell. Yes, because you want to try and get the vitamins and minerals in there. When
Yeah.
a fermentation sticks, it's because it's run out of magnesium and zinc. When you pyruvate acetaldehyde then to ethanol, you need magnesium for the first step, zinc for the second step, and if you don't have those, just adding more yeast, it can take the sugar, take it through glycolysis, and it will stick at pyruvate. So the Go Farm Protect Evolution actually is for the minerals and the importance of those.
Yeah, I haven't had any issues with that.
Too.
You know, I did run into a client one time that had added like, we had actually, and I think about it, we had the Stucks in 2009 from Pinot and Santa Rita Hills. And I remember we had added with some lot, we had added everything twice, you know, I mean, so many times. And what we did end up getting was this kind of sweetness, but we didn't actually get up we didn't see any off aromas, you know, given how many times we'd added stuff. But it did seem to taste sweet, even though it was dry. It was really interesting. Best way to raise the bricks to 5. Concentrate. I mean, I've used sugar and concentrate.
The official answer is whatever way is legal based on the state you're in.
Yeah. Yep.
Check with your state regs.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
You can use your concentration volume relationship equation to calculate your adds. It also depends on how much sugar is in that PIED-DE-CUVE starter to begin with, based on what's stuck.
Is it half the total dose of ferment K or the whole dose both times?
So I just answered that in the chat.
You did. Okay.
Is this for primary ferment or restart? If it's for primary ferment, it depends on what your starting yan is, the starting sugar, the yeast strain that you choose to use. That will tell you how much nitrogen you need to supplement, and then you will add your nitrogen depending on that. So check out page, I think it's 44 in the handbook. If anybody from Scott Labs is still on, they can, I can't find my handbook. They can let me know if that's where the nutrient supplementation planner is.
It's in there.
I think it's page 44.
Yeah, I think it is too, actually. I think about it because I just told somebody that. How often do we need to mix the tanks?
For what?
For restarts.
I would mix daily. Keep
daily.
Your yeast in suspension. If your yeast is not in suspension, it doesn't have access to the sugar. Doesn't have access to the sugar, it can't consume it.
Good enough. And then how do you DVA again? That's typically a RO. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
No, on you go.
Right now what we have is basically for the most part RO, reverse osmosis, a membrane, and it's if it's a good way to do it, they'll have a very tight membrane that allows just mostly alcohol and acetic acid through that into the permeate, and that permeate then is treated with either a cation exchange column only or a cation and then a anion exchange column. So it can be you can rent some Roadrunner units, which essentially they send you the unit. It's still expensive. I think the last time I priced it's at least $1,000 or $1,500, and then you run the equipment yourself. But any process of VA removal typically will affect the flavors. But honestly, my record for one harvest with the client was 25. And we DVA on 25 lots and went through the restart process, and every single one of them finished fine after DVA. And then the wines ended up tasting fantastic. So I really can't stress enough oftentimes how good that is. And
it's not something that we have at Scott Laboratories. No. It is an external service. So if you just Google removing VA, you'll come up with Contech, Wine Secrets, VA filtration. I'm sorry for other people that I'm forgetting, but those are kind of the companies that are coming to mind.
Yeah, we're not typically endorsing any specific process, but you know, if anybody has any questions, they can ask me. I've done a fair amount, so it's been and I say that openly. It's just a process that sometimes happens. And I had, you know, a lot of consulting clients in the winery I used to help run, so it's always a pleasure to be able to have to talk about that with folks. And then, do you recommend checking yeast count and viability?
You can. You will probably want to do it genetically or using PCR because you get the result much quicker. The other thing with acetic acid bacteria, definitely with Brettanomyces, not so much Saccharomyces reported in the literature, but it can always happen, is the cells going to viable but non-culturable status, which means they are just taken away at the very bare minimum to keep themselves alive, and they don't show up on plating. So if you want a true assessment of the microbiological fingerprint in the wine, PCR is the way to go. If your PCR comes back and you've got no Saccharomyces, you're going to know that you're going to have to add more yeast. Same with Enococcus. If you're doing an ml, if it comes back, you've got no Enococcus, or you have less than 1 million Enococcus cells per milliliter, you're going to have to add bacteria. If your cell comes back and you've got a decent population, but it's not fermenting, you know that they may be viable, but they're not vital. And we don't have a good assessment for vitality. So you'll get some information by doing a viability test. We just don't have a vitality assessment as of yet. Wow, if you've got no yeast there, it's going to tell you got no yeast.
Yeah, but like say it's one of those situations where you might have viability, you know, or like the yeast don't pull up any stain, but you still don't have conversion of sugar into alcohol.
No, then that's the difference. Microbial presence. How do we determine microbial impact? What is that viability thing? And that's the big piece that we're missing.
Yeah.
And that's why we monitor sugar depletion, because that's giving us a fermentation capacity or a vitality assessment.
Okay, that kind of makes sense. And the slides will be available, you guys. We'll have to post it on our website. And then I'm going to share some results of the polling. So first polling, how often have you had a stuck fermentation? About 50% of us said once in a great while. Some of us said at least once a year. And then some said multiple times a year. And then a couple said, no, never, ever, ever have they ever had a stuck ferment, which I do appreciate. Antimicrobial agents have you used for stuck fermentation? Select all that apply. 56% of us used SO2. 31% of us said they used lysozyme. 15% of us said chitosan, chitin glucan, bacillus. 12% actually used love, which I really liked. Love is a very powerful force. We still don't have a whole lot of data that supports that, and then some of us, a good 25% of us actually said they don't use anything at all when they do their restarts. And then fructophilic yeast. Do you consider yeast fructophilic ability to ferment fructose when considering for stuck or sluggish ferments? 60% of us said yes, 39% of us said no, and then one person said, I don't know what fructose is. And I really do appreciate your honesty with that. Sometimes I don't know what fructose is. After we've had enough of these meetings, I start to lose what fructose is and glucose and everything else.
So fructose, Darren?
Huh?
So fructose is?
I know what fructose is. It's just after so many days.
Grape juice is comprised of glucose and fructose.
Yes.
At the start of ferment, we have equal portions of both. The yeast will preferentially take up the glucose, leaving the glucose and fructose ratio unbalanced. And the yeast have a harder time taking up the fructose in a very challenging environment.
Yeah, and I was just saying that after enough of a busy harvest, it's kind of like fructose. Should you ask and then somebody commented, we should ask the person who's never had a stuck fermentation for their protocol.
I make sweet wine.
No, I would love that. I would think that's worth a lot of money. Well, that's it, you guys. Thank you again for your time. Thank you again. I can't stress that enough. If you get a chance, please submit a survey if we have the survey. Our upcoming topics are always based in comments, so you keep them coming. Give us feedback. I love feedback. Give me feedback. Love feedback. Don't hesitate to reach out. Have any other questions or comments if we believe in continual improvement. My email is darrenm@scottlab.com, darrenm@scottlab.com. We post the webinars on our website, so just Google Scott Labs webinars, should show up in the search results. Thank you again so much. Thank you, Nichola. Please, once again, that was a great presentation. I'm hoping a lot of people, we are looking at doing a little bit extra content, and we are doing some redesign, so look for that, guys. But thank you, Nichola. Did you have any other final comments?
Nope. If you've got questions, just give us a call. The technical staff will be able to help you and walk you through best course of action. That is what we're here for.
Yes, and I want to say really quick, you know what? It's been a crazy year, and if the stuck fermentation is the least of your problems, that's fantastic. But it really does happen to most everyone. That's why I kind of chuckle when they say never, because how many times if somebody was said to me when I left from Sutter Home, which we really have any, can you imagine? Because there's just so much volume and so much wine you got to get through. But like when I started working at Vincroy years ago, and people were like, I've been in this industry 25 years and I've never had it stuck. And I'm like, well, I feel bad for you because now you got to learn. But thank you, Nichola. Thank you guys for showing up. We'll post this. Have a
Take
great
care. Stay
Have a
healthy.
great Thanksgiving, and we don't see you.
Bye-bye.